How much time should you spend on flashcards? Is Remembering the Hanzi good for learning Chinese characters? And what resources should you use if you want to understand the writing system better? Hello and welcome to the Hacking Chinese podcast. In this week's episode, I'm going to answer 3 questions about learning vocabulary in Chinese. So that includes words, characters, and also the underlying writing system. Before we get to that though, I'd like to talk a little bit about the vocabulary challenge that will start on June 10th and last until the end of the month. I host one challenge every month focusing on one specific aspect of learning Chinese, and this time it is vocabulary. These challenges are free to join, and the idea is to help you learn a little bit more than you would otherwise have done. June's challenge is focused on vocabulary, and this is of course also why I'm talking about that in this week's episode. The vocabulary challenge is sponsored by Skritter, which is an app for learning vocabulary in Chinese and Japanese. If you haven't tried Skritter before, this is the perfect opportunity to do so, because if you use the link and discount code in the show notes, you will get Skritter for free for the duration of the challenge. Beyond that, 3 active participants in the challenge will also receive 3-month subscriptions to Skritter for free, and this will work for students who are already subscribed to Skritter as well. So the challenge starts on the 10th, and I hope to see you there. Okay, let's get started with the Q&A, and today, as usual, we have 3 questions. The first one is about how much time to spend on flashcards. The second one is about a specific resource for learning Chinese characters called Remembering the Hanzi. And the third and final question is about resources for learning about the Chinese writing system more in general rather than specific characters. So let's get started. The first question comes from Elena, and it's basically about how much time is appropriate to spend on flashcards when learning Chinese. And this is a question I've heard dozens of times, and it is indeed very common in general. She describes a situation where she feels that she's drowning in flashcards, and she knows that they are useful. For example, I've said that flashcards are quite useful, but she wants to know how she can avoid feeling like she's doing nothing but flashcards, and she also feels that she might be missing out on other things she should be doing. This is a good question, and asking it means that you have some awareness of the problem and that you have indeed identified something that I think is really an issue for many students. I won't explore why it is that some people tend to use flashcards a lot, but I think it's related to things like measurable progress, having a clearly defined task, and having measurable goals and things like that. But the fact is that there are a lot of students who use flashcards a little bit too much, and if Elena is using it too much is a little bit hard to say, but I'll try to answer this in a way that might help you figure out if you are using flashcards too much. In extreme cases, I've heard about people who cut down on other forms of learning because they feel that they can't keep up with their flashcards. So they might not read enough or listen enough or indeed have conversations because they feel they have to get their flashcards done first. And this is definitely not a good place to be in. Flashcards can be useful, but they are a supplement to other things you should also be doing. Just like strength training can be useful for most sports, but nobody thinks that going to the gym to lift weights will make you excellent at basketball. Similarly, I think that using flashcards to get better at, say, reading or listening in Chinese can be very useful, but you should of course spend a majority of your time actually reading and actually listening. I will discuss some possible exceptions later, but I think in general, Paul Nation's 4 strands is the best guide available for how to balance your language learning. This is something I discussed in detail in episode 94, so do check that out if you're interested. But in general, he's talking about 4 different strands or 4 different areas of language learning, and according to him, these should be roughly balanced. So the first strand is meaning-focused input. So that means listening and reading where the goal is to understand what is being said or what is written, and where you're using material on a level where this is possible. For example, you can use graded readers or listen to podcasts aimed at your level where you are able to understand most things, and the goal when you read and listen then is to understand. Not like in most standard textbooks where reading is mostly about seeing how the vocabulary and grammar is used. The second strand is meaning-focused output, so this is when you speak and write with the main goal of communicating with somebody else. Again, not to practice a grammar pattern, not to see if you've understood how a word is used, but to genuinely convey information or ideas to someone else. Then I'll mix up the order a bit and talk about the fourth strand before we talk about the third. And the fourth is fluency development. So this is essentially getting better and faster at what you already know. And this requires you to focus on things you already do know so that you can perform better, faster, and so on. This is something I covered in detail in episode 99, so check that out if you want to become fluent in Chinese. So let's hop back to the third strand, which is what we're actually interested in here, and that's why I put it last, and that is language-focused learning. So this would be everything that doesn't fit in the other categories, and that's quite a lot if you think about it, especially if you're looking at how traditional language classes are arranged. This would then include things like pronunciation practice and grammar drills, which are not about meaning at all, it's about focusing on the form of the pronunciation or the written shapes of characters and so on. It also includes flashcards, which are not meaning-focused. The goal of studying a flashcard is to remember the word. It is not to use it to convey information to a real person. It is not to understand something in context and make sense of a passage or something like that. So it's definitely language-focused. So according to Nation then, we should invest roughly the same amount of time in these four strands. And it goes without saying then that if pronunciation practice, grammar drills, flashcards and so on, all are supposed to fit in this 25%, this one strand, the flashcards themselves should make up a very limited amount of your total study time. And this is something I agree completely with. If anything, I would say that you should spend even less than 25% of your study time on language-focused activities, not more. This means that we have an upper bound for studying flashcards at something like 25%, but this also assumes that you're doing no other language-focused learning, such as grammar practice or pronunciation drills. There is no lower limit here. You can definitely spend 0% of your study time on flashcards and still learn Chinese very well. You can invest all that time into listening and reading and using the language, and you'll do fine. If I were to recommend something more specific between 0 and 25%, maybe I will end up around 10%, but I think it depends on how much you're studying. If you're studying full-time, for example, spending 4 hours out of 40 each week on flashcards is probably okay, especially if you're doing handwriting and focus on that. But if you're studying Chinese on the side and you maybe spend 4 hours a week instead of 40, I think it can make sense to spend a little bit more on flashcards, because if you can spread your reviewing out throughout the day, such as when you're waiting in a queue somewhere or when you're stuck in traffic or something, then you can maintain and expand vocabulary rather efficiently so that when you do have time to listen and read, you will get more out of it. Still, flashcards should never be an excuse for not reading and listening, at least not in the long run. If you want a much more in-depth discussion about flashcards, I spent 3 episodes late last year talking about that, starting in episode 173, and I will also put links to these articles in the show notes so you can find them easily. Moving on to question number 2, which is from Richard, and this is about a resource called Remembering the Hanzi by James Heisig and Timothy Richardson. And this method is often referred to simply as Heisig, and it was first developed for learning kanji in Japanese, which of course are Chinese characters, so it would then be natural to think, can you use this approach for learning Chinese characters as well? And they certainly thought so, because they have published books aimed at Chinese learners, and this is what this question is about. I should mention that Richard says that he has used Heisig to successfully learn Japanese, and he's wondering how applicable this will be when he now wants to learn Chinese. And this is, of course, a very specific question. I assume that most listeners have not first learned Japanese, so I will try to answer this question in a general sense. Before I do that, I think I need to say something about how the method works, and I might return to this in a later episode and talk specifically about Heisig's method for learning kanji and Chinese characters, but this will have to be an overview. So the basic idea is that you break down characters into components, and this is not unusual. Most methods for successfully learning Chinese characters involve components in some way, and realizing that building blocks are important. What makes this method stand out is that they have developed a system where each component has one linked image. This means that each component that is used in Chinese characters have a specific image that you can then use to memorize the whole character. If you are familiar with memory techniques, you can think of this as a huge pegging system where you have somewhat abstract things, such as components in Chinese characters, and you associate them with a specific image. And you can imagine this being quite useful. For example, there are many character components that refer to weapons of different kinds. So simply remembering that it is a pole arm is not enough, because there are maybe 3 or 4 of those that are commonly used in characters. So what they've done is to come up with one specific image for each component, and they then use these primitives, as they call them, to build compounds and teach you the Chinese writing system. And they do this based on what makes sense in the written language, so they start with simple components and build those into simple compounds and so on. They don't care that, say, ni or wo are the most commonly used words in spoken Chinese, because those characters are clearly not the easiest to learn. You start with things like yi, er, san, and so on, and then you build upwards. This sounds pretty cool, and I think the basic idea is pretty cool, and there are many people who swear by this method for learning kanji in Japanese. But I think there are some differences between Japanese and Chinese that makes the method much less useful for learning Chinese, and I will try to summarize why here. The first problem is that this method focuses on the written forms and their meaning, but it completely ignores sound. So it means that you will learn what these components mean and how they can form compounds with other components. And that's great. But the problem is that 90%, or maybe even more than 90% of Chinese characters are combinations of sound and meaning. We have one part that gives the sound and one that gives the meaning. And if you only focus on meaning, you will never understand how the Chinese writing system works, and most characters simply will not make sense at all. I wrote an article a few years ago about different levels of understanding when it comes to Chinese characters, and I'll put a link in the show notes. And this method then is at a very superficial level. You're completely ignoring the function that each component has in its compound. And this is not good for understanding how it works, and therefore it's also not very good for learning and remembering these things. An example would be all the characters that contain horse, which you have probably seen several, even if you started learning Chinese very recently. We have the question particle ma, we have ma as in mother, we have ma as in to scold someone, and so on. And these all share the horse component, and they do so because they are all pronounced ma with different tones. And this is something that you just miss. It's not in here. You don't learn the pronunciation for each of the characters. You will never see this relationship if you use this method. And of course, you won't be able to read them aloud either. I think this is less of an issue when learning Japanese, because the link between the kanji and the pronunciation in Japanese is much less direct than it is in Chinese, and so learning these things separately might make sense. Whereas in Chinese, I definitely don't think it makes sense to separate the spoken language and the written language in this way. The second problem I have with Heisig's method is that many of the primitives, so these smallest building blocks, are not related to the actual meaning of the components. And this is a big deal, because Chinese characters mean things. The components are there for a reason, and often knowing this reason is very helpful. And I don't mean this only because of the phonetic components that I mentioned earlier, because these are clearly ignored. I mean that even many of the meaning components actually aren't related to the actual meaning of those characters. I also find it strange that many of these characters actually do change meaning in different stories depending on the context. So if we take a character like Tian, which means field, this often means field, which is fine. I mean, that's what a character means, but it also sometimes represents brain and gray matter, which is less obvious. The third issue with this method, and this is maybe more down to personal preference, but I don't think that the mnemonic stories that they use to weave these different components together to form compounds are very good. I have spent a lot of time with mnemonics in my life trying to remember different things, including, of course, Chinese characters, and many of the mnemonics that they use are too abstract or just don't work for me personally. So just to give you an example here, we have the character for Chao, which means noisy, and of course they don't mention that the right component, Shao, is pronounced almost exactly the same, and that is the reason it's there, but I already mentioned that, so let's move on to the mnemonic bit. You might think that noisy should be associated with many people talking at once, but the idea in this character is much more philosophical than that. What happens when things get noisy is that people's vocabulary shrinks to a more Neolithic level the higher the volume is turned up. And so it is that noisy becomes associated with the very few things a mouth can say when it is talking loudly. Try to picture people quoting Shakespeare to each other in a shouting match, and you will see how right this character is. This explanation to me is just weird. It includes a lot of stuff that is completely irrelevant, doesn't mean anything, and is just made up. There is no deep philosophy involved here, it's just a phonetic component plus a semantic component. And then, as I've said many times, feel free to make up a mnemonic. But this thing with associating noisy with the very few things a mouth can say when it's talking loudly is way too abstract, convoluted, and frankly a bit hard to understand, to be honest. Anyway, like I said, if it works for you, fine, but it doesn't work for me. Still, I do understand why some people like Heisig, and it's simply because it's one of the few complete systems, or fairly complete, where you can learn a lot about the writing system, you learn the building blocks and how they fit together and so on. And then, given that some of the building blocks don't mean what you think they mean, and that the way they are combined is usually completely made up, you could argue that it's just better to focus on the actual meaning and the actual way they fit together, and that this will also teach you more about the writing system and will be more useful and interesting in general. But maybe as a beginner it's hard to say that this is the case, and it's hard to really know what you're missing out on. And like I said, it's one of the few systems that do take you through the first few thousand characters and introduce all the components and so on. Personally, as I said in that article about depth of understanding when it comes to Chinese characters, I think this is too superficial. You're making up too many things, and you're basically spending many hours memorizing things that are only there to memorize other things. They have no relation to reality, and beyond this system then they are not very useful. And to me this seems like a waste of time. This does not mean that it's impossible to use this system to learn Chinese characters. There are many people out there who testify to the effectiveness of the method, but I simply think that there are better ways of doing this. That is also a good segue to the third question, which is about the writing system as a whole. So not really resources for learning individual characters and components in characters and how they fit together and so on, but more about the writing system as a system. I have just said several times that Heisig's method doesn't really teach you anything about how the Chinese writing system actually works. It's just an approach for learning it, which is basically decoupled from historical processes and so on. But if you want to learn how the writing system works, so you can use this to your benefit, so you can basically plug all the holes that I talked about when talking about Heisig, which resources should you use? This question was sent in by Luca, and he wants to know specifically if there are any free resources that he can use. I'm going to answer by first giving some free resources, but then also pointing to some more serious resources that are not free. First, I have written a series of articles called The Building Blocks of Chinese that will take you through all the basics of things that I've mentioned in this episode previously. So for example, if you don't know what a phonetic component is, or what a semantic component is, or how they fit together to form compounds, or how several characters then form words together, this series is for you. It is 6 episodes long, or 6 articles long, and I'll put links to those in the description. These are of course completely free, they are on Hacking Chinese, and it will give you a basic understanding of the issues we're talking about here. If you want a more structured approach that also teaches you some characters, and this is particularly useful if you're a beginner or at least lower intermediate, you could check out the character course that I built for Skritter, and that is included in the trial, so you don't have to pay for Skritter before getting access to the course. So for example, during the vocabulary challenge, you can get access to Skritter, you can complete the course and gain the understanding you need to learn characters more efficiently in the future. It essentially covers similar ground to the series of articles that I just mentioned on Hacking Chinese, but it's in video format, it's much more carefully produced, and it has a lot higher production value in general. Like I said, it will also teach you some 150 characters and character components, whereas my articles usually just have examples in them. Next up, if you want to really understand the Chinese writing system, and these resources that I've mentioned are not enough, I think you should check out Outlier Linguistics, and in particular, you should check out their Chinese Character Masterclass. And as the name implies, this is a course that goes pretty deeply into how characters work. And while I don't think it's optimal for beginners, it works well for everybody above that level. I have written articles and recorded podcast episodes both about the Chinese character course on Skritter and about Outlier's masterclass, so I'll put links to both of those in the description. This brings us to the end of the episode, and the only thing remaining is to wish you good luck in the vocabulary challenge, or if you're listening to this in the future, good luck with your vocabulary learning in general. Thank you for tuning in to the Hacking Chinese podcast. If you like this episode, please share it. More information and inspiration about learning and teaching Chinese can be found at hackingchinese.com. See you in the next episode, and until then, good luck with your studies.